Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. My name is Rob Richardson. I'm the Clean Energy Communities Coordinator for the Genesee Finger Lakes region. As we've discussed, we're in the public comments period right now for the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was passed in 2019. And we're looking to put together a regional response to that to really make sure that the concerns and the voices of the Genesee Finger Lakes region are heard in response to this legislation. And we're lucky enough today to have Mark Lowery, who is the Assistant Director for the Office of Climate Change from the Department of Environmental Conservation, here to talk to us today about the CLCPA and some of its finer points and how it could potentially impact communities in our region. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, so if you could please put them in the chat, and we'll get to all of them when Mark has finished his presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob, for setting this up, and thank you to all the participants. I look forward to your questions, but I will try to give an overview. Just be aware that the draft scoping plan that I'm going to be talking about is, I think, 340 pages of long, and it has a 500-page appendix with it, plus literally thousands and thousands of pages of supporting documents that are available on the website. So I'm only going to be able to give a pretty high-level overview. I'll try to touch on some subjects that I suspect are important to folks in your profession, but certainly open to any questions. But most importantly, I want to talk about your opportunities to provide input and how you actually go about doing that. But let's start at the beginning. As Rob mentioned, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which you will hear me refer to as the Climate Act or the Climate Law or just the statute. We enacted that law, the state enacted that law in 2019, and it went into effect on January 1st of 2020. So just be aware that even though we are have produced a draft scoping plan and are taking public comment on it, that draft scoping plan covers some aspects of the requirements of the law, but not all of them. And some aspects have been in place for over a year now. The statute sets achievement of a net zero economy by 2050 as a goal, for which the Climate Action Council is responsible, and I'll describe who that council is. It requires an 85% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions while allowing for sequestration of up to 15% of the state's economy-wide emissions. And all these percentages are based on a 1990 baseline. The statute sets an interim greenhouse gas emission limit of no more than 60% of 1990 levels by 2030. That is, it requires a 40% reduction by 2030. And it requires DEC to promulgate a regulation to set those 60% and 15% emissions limit, which we have already done. Although the Climate Act does not detail an emissions reduction plan, it envisions an overall strategy of beneficial electrification of the entire state economy and powering that efficient electrified economy with clean sources of power. That includes 70% renewable electricity by 2030. That means that all electricity sold in New York State, whether it comes from out of the state or is generated within the state, must come from renewable sources, meaning wind, water, and solar power. By 2040, 100% of all electricity sold in the state, regardless of whether it comes from out of the state or in the state, must be from zero carbon electricity. And zero carbon electricity under New York State policy includes nuclear. It also includes investments in long-term storage to balance the intermittency that is inherent to both to wind, water, and solar power. In support of this overall electrification strategy, the law requires the Public Service Commission to undertake proceedings to ensure large investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And there have been numerous announcements of leases or purchases, I should say, of offshore wind in particular. Down the road from where I live, there is an active development to construct what will be the wind turbines that will be put out in the Atlantic to meet some of this demand. The law requires that investments in disadvantaged communities be prioritized and that support be provided to individuals and communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuel industries as they make the transition to the clean energy economy. And I will note that recently, even though this slide in the law says that we must have 6 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2025, that goal has been updated because we are on track to exceed that goal. So that goal is being updated to 10 gigawatts by 2030 for distributed solar. The statute charges DEC with being the primary regulator in limiting greenhouse gas emissions, although other agencies may also issue regulations and indeed are required to do so if necessary with this statute as their authority to issue those regulations. Agency regulations are to be guided by a scoping plan, which in turn is to be developed by the Climate Action Council. The scoping plan must be reflected in agency regulations and also in the first state energy plan to be issued after completion of the scoping plan. And I believe that state energy plan, which would go into more detail on how the scoping plan is being would be issued. The energy plan, I believe, is due in 2025. The law requires that the draft scoping plan be available for a public comment period of at least 120 days and subject to at least 6 public hearings. And as you'll see, we are exceeding that in terms of providing we are exceeding that minimum requirement in terms of providing an opportunity for public comment. This Climate Action Council that I've referred to a few times comprises 22 appointees, with the president and CEO of NYSERDA, currently Doreen Harris, and the Commissioner of DEC, Basil Sego, serving as the co-chairs. Pursuant to the statute, the council appointed 7 advisory panels to make recommendations for greenhouse gas emission reductions in each of 7 major emission sectors. I happen to have been appointed to the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel. I'll just get that out there. The council also asked the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel to develop adaptation and resilience recommendations. Even though the law does not require the scoping plan to address adapting to the effects of climate change, it authorizes it, and the council did ask us to include in the draft scoping plan such recommendations. All the recommendations that have been approved by the council to date are now embodied in the draft scoping plan, which the council released for public comment on December 30th of 2021. As I mentioned, the statute has a heavy emphasis on climate and environmental justice and requires the Climate Justice Working Group, which is a separate body. It is not subservient, if you will, to the Climate Action Council, but is authorized under a separate statute. But the law requires this Climate Justice Working Group to establish the criteria by which disadvantaged communities are to be identified. The Climate Justice Working Group has released those criteria and supporting maps for public comment as well. So we have 2 concurrent public comment periods going on, one on the draft scoping plan and the other on the disadvantaged community criteria. Like the draft scoping plan, these draft criteria are to be subject to a 120-day comment period, which we are currently in, and at least 6 public hearings, which I believe I heard this morning have been scheduled. They had not been most recently, so I had to go. I didn't get didn't have a chance to double check that schedule. But if they had been scheduled, the schedule for those disadvantaged community hearings will be at climate.ny.gov, the statute's website. I think I jumped ahead there. There we go. The reason identification of these disadvantaged communities is important is that the council is required to prioritize the benefits of clean energy investments made pursuant to the law to these disadvantaged communities. In fact, it requires that at least 35%, with a goal of 40% of the benefits of those clean energy investments go to these disadvantaged communities. So it's important and certainly potentially controversial as to the criteria by which these communities are to be identified. As DEC develops its regulations to implement the council's recommendations, it's required to ensure that disadvantaged communities are not subjected to any disproportionate burden of those regulations. And one of the factors that are to be considered in identifying those communities is past environmental burdens. And so the law stipulates that any past burdens are not to be exacerbated by what we do here to implement the CLCPA. And DEC must prepare a strategy to monitor and reduce emissions of co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. And that program, the department will announce very soon. An often overlooked but important part of the CLCPA is its Section 7. And I don't want to sound like a lawyer, and I won't get too much more legalistic than that, but I do want to mention that Section 7 does require all state agencies to reduce their own operational emissions, as you might expect. More significantly, however, Section 7 requires all state agencies in considering any considering any action, whether it's issuing a permit, a license, funding, establishing a funding program, whatever it may be, to determine that action's consistency with the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. The guidance for how we are going to do that has not been finalized yet, but DEC has already used this requirement as the basis for denying 2 permits to repower existing power plants. One is in Astoria, New York, and the other the Danskammer power plant. These denials that were based on this Section 7 are now the subject of appeals in court, so we'll see how they work out. But they are examples of the way the department may use this requirement and authority in the future. Although public focus has been largely on the greenhouse gas reduction requirements of the Act, Section 9 made significant amendments to the Community Risk and Resiliency Act of 2014. As amended, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act now requires consideration of all climate change effects during review of applications for all major permits in almost all of DEC's regulatory programs. So in our wetlands program, our coastal erosion hazard program, all of these programs that are covered by the Uniform Procedures Act, applicants for major permits under those programs may be asked, in fact, are required to be asked how they are considering climate change in their project design. And this law authorizes DEC to require mitigation of significant climate risk to virtually any asset that's not actually owned by the applicant. So where are we now? As I mentioned, the law took effect on January 1st of 2020. And due to COVID, we did have a slow start. Executive staff, the governor's staff, which had to make appointments to the Climate Action Council, obviously was dealing with the COVID pandemic and focused elsewhere. But we still have the original statutory deadlines. The governor, the legislature, neither the governor nor the legislature nor our own leadership have given the council nor staff any dispensation over the deadlines, about meeting the deadlines that are in the law. And so we have been working very hard to catch up. And I'll talk about what those deadlines are here in a moment. Just to set the time scale, though, the council first met in March of 2020, and later that year, the 7 advisory panels began to develop their own recommendations, including extensive public consultation. All of the advisory panel meetings, as well as all the council meetings, were open to the public. Not that they were public meetings, but the members of the public who were interested could at least watch those meetings. And the advisory panels did provide opportunity for the public to provide input on the recommendations that were under development. The advisory panels presented their recommendations to the council in the spring and early summer of 2021. And about that time, staff, mostly at DEC, NYSERDA, and the Department of Public Service, but others as well, began preparing the draft scoping plan as consensus formed on the council around the recommendations that would be included in the draft plan. As we said, the council released the draft scoping plan in December of 2021, and the public comment period began on January 1st of 2022. The final scoping plan is due before January 1st, 2023. That is by the end of this year. And DEC is further required to promulgate the regulations to achieve the required emission reductions as guided by the scoping plan just 1 year later. That is by the end of 2023. In parallel to the council's deliberative processes, and in addition to supporting the council and various advisory panels, sorry about that. Sorry, mouse is a little touchy here. So in parallel to supporting the council and the various advisory panels, agency staff have completed several other required milestones, including the Public Service Commission's adoption of a new 70 by 30 clean energy standard that reflects the requirements of the law. DEC and NYSERDA issue a report on barriers to clean energy and adaptation resources and opportunities to overcome those barriers in disadvantaged communities in December of 2021, again, a requirement of the statute. And DEC has also finalized and released guidance on the use of the social cost of carbon, the required regulations setting the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas emission limits, and a regulation limiting end uses of certain hydrofluorocarbons, which are very powerful global refrigerants with very high global warming potential. And as required by the Climate Act, DEC issued a greenhouse gas emissions report at the end of 2021. So DEC is now required by law to issue the state's greenhouse gas inventory every year. So based on the 2021 report, we can see the enormity of the challenge that we face under the law. It's illustrated by that bar graph on the right, reducing the state's greenhouse gas emissions from about 375 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to about 61 million metric tons over the next 30 years. On the left, the inner ring of that circular graph indicates the relative proportions represented by our major emission sectors. In the outer ring, the contribution of sources within each of those sectors. And we don't need to study all that in detail, but it is useful to understand the current major sources of emissions to help us understand the selection of strategies that have been included in the draft scoping plan. Although many people tend to think of power plants as the major cause of climate change, in New York, because we have what we believe is the cleanest electric grid in the nation, with lots of hydropower and a current nuclear fleet, our power generation emissions are only about 13% of our total state's emissions. In New York State, the transportation sector at 28% and the buildings sector at 32% represent much larger sources of emissions. And when I talk about building related emissions here, we're not talking about the electricity use, that's included in the power generation emissions. Here we're talking about building emissions that are primarily the result of combustion of fossil fuels to heat space and water, and to dry clothes and for cooking. Waste management, which includes methane emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants, comes in at 12%, so almost as much greenhouse gases emitted from our waste activities as for power generation, electrical power generation. Agriculture in New York is an important but relatively small portion of the state's emissions at 6%. I should note that the New York State greenhouse gas inventory under the law accounts for upstream emissions associated with the combustion of fossil fuel. That, for example, methane emissions associated with extraction and transmission of natural gas from other states, but that we burn here. Under prior inventories, if you look at the old inventories that NYSERDA used to do, they only accounted for greenhouse gases emitted when, for instance, oil or natural gas was combusted, just the byproduct of combustion. But under the law, we are now required to account for all of the upstream emissions associated with those fossil fuels, whether they are emitted in the state or out of the state. However, our inventory does not account for the emissions embedded in other things that we buy and consume, and the draft scoping plan does not include any recommendations for directly influencing consumer demand. The council's planning has been informed by analysis performed by NYSERDA to integrate all the advisory panel recommendations to assess their likely total effects on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the costs and benefits of those strategies. This analysis included a reference case based on business as usual, that is doing what we're doing now, plus greenhouse gas reduction policies are already in place. It also included a scenario 1, that included all the recommendations as presented by the advisory panel. So no prioritization, just put everything into the mix, everything that had been recommended into the mix, and see what the total effect is. Unfortunately, that analysis indicated that all the panel recommendations put together were not sufficient to achieve the required emission reductions. It would not be compliant with the law, and so we don't even show that scenario number 1 here. To its credit, the council went back to the drawing board and developed the 3 action scenarios that we do describe here, all of which would be expected to achieve the reductions required by the law. All these scenarios include, in common, certain foundational strategies in the power generation, transportation, agriculture, and waste sectors. All have a heavy emphasis on rapid electrification and gains in energy efficiency that must be included if we are to achieve the required greenhouse gas emission reductions. But the 3 scenarios do provide for some different approaches to reducing emissions from some sources. All scenarios include zero emissions electricity generation, full electrification of buildings and transportation eventually, aggressive action to reduce vehicle miles traveled, a transition to low global warming potential refrigerants, and elimination of fugitive methane emissions primarily from agricultural operations and from oil and gas infrastructure. Scenarios 2 and 3 differ in that scenario 2 includes use of low carbon fuels derived from biomass and green hydrogen, while scenario 3 includes an accelerated transition away from all combustion. And this reflects different views on whether we actually will produce enough biomass to meet needs for renewable natural gas if that scenario is chosen, versus concerns about co-pollutants. Whenever we burn even renewable natural gas, other pollutants are produced, and there are a lot of concerns about the impact on air quality, local air quality in particular, taking that scenario. So scenario 3 would have a more accelerated transition away from all combustion. And even green hydrogen remains somewhat controversial due to the potential emissions associated with producing the electricity that would be used to produce green hydrogen. There's a scenario 4, which would include more limited use of low carbon fuels while accelerating the pace with which some of the policies are implemented, particularly acceleration of policies intended to drive building electrification, reduction of vehicle miles traveled even faster, and more rapid reduction of methane emissions. None of these scenarios represents a specific plan or recommendation, but they are intended to illustrate the range of options that are available to decision makers and on which the council is inviting stakeholder comment now. The draft scoping plan and supporting documents at climate.ny.gov describe the greenhouse gas reduction strategies in detail, and I'll just provide a very high-level summary of the strategies that are common to all 3 action scenarios. And I would encourage you, if you have an interest in some of the details, to take a look at the draft scoping plan itself, as well as the supporting documentation. All 3 strategies include deep improvements in energy efficiency across all sectors, but particularly in our buildings, where more than half of New York State's 6 million buildings will require building shell improvements, which will in turn reduce energy bills, improve comfort, and provide improved passive resilience to power outages. The draft scoping plan calls for eventual electrification of heating water and space, primarily through use of high efficiency heat pumps. We're not talking about old resistance heating. We're talking about high efficiency heat pumps, either ground source heat pumps or high efficient air source heat pumps, which will function. I have them in my house. They function down to 13 below. Some are getting better than that. The plan also calls for the elimination of gas for cooking, eventual elimination of gas for cooking and drying clothes, first in new buildings and eventually in existing buildings, with a phase out of gas home appliances by 2035. I want to emphasize, however, despite what you may have seen in your YouTube or Facebook posts over the weekend, there is no call that anyone is going to be confiscating or forcing anyone to give up gas appliances that they currently use. And newer appliances are much more efficient. We're not talking about cooking on old electric coil, electric stoves. We're talking about an induction range. I've used an induction cooktop for the last 5 years. I would not go back to gas. My son, who has been a professional chef, would also prefer an induction cooktop to gas. To help achieve climate justice and conserve land, the plan calls for enhanced mass transit, true smart growth, and other strategies to reduce miles traveled in passenger cars and trucks. All three action scenarios include electrification of light-duty vehicles, and the governor, as you probably know, has already signed legislation that would ban the sale of gas and diesel-powered cars and trucks in New York State by 2035. And of course, we see the industry rapidly moving in that direction anyway. And of course, the plan recognizes that our newly electrified economy must be powered by zero emissions electricity. The plan includes strategies to eliminate high global warming potential refrigerants, as well as fugitive methane emissions across the waste, agriculture, and energy sectors, while maximizing carbon sequestration in New York State's lands and forests through land conservation and improved soil and forest management. And it includes strategies to develop the diverse portfolio solutions that will be necessary to electrify industry and to improve its energy efficiency. It is likely that low carbon fuels such as biomass or green hydrogen will be necessary in at least some amounts in some hard to electrify sectors such as aviation, heavy duty vehicles, and high temperature industrial processes. With regard to electricity demand, as New York State transitions, as we replace fossil fuel heating systems with heat pumps, New York State's electrical power demand will transition from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system. Bioenergy or green hydrogen, in addition to long-term battery storage, will likely be necessary to ensure grid reliability as electrical consumption doubles over time. I do want to also emphasize that grid reliability has been one of the principles or hallmarks of all the conversations that have taken place regarding switching to the clean energy grid. There are very strict FERC, federal and state requirements with regard to grid reliability, and the council is quite cognizant of all of those reliability requirements. The Climate Act allows us to count sequestration of the equivalent of up to 15% of our 1990 emissions toward achievement of our net zero goal. However, achieving this level of additional sequestration will be difficult due to the fact that New York State is already heavily forested. So trying to sequester more carbon by planting more trees will be difficult. We may be limited in our potential to do that. And if that turns out to be the case, we may have to reduce our emissions by more than 85% of their 1990 levels, or to rely on technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration. Of course, there will be costs, but no one is going to be expected to purchase at the outset $30,000 or $40,000 worth of equipment, of new home appliances, as some of the misinformation has tried to tell the public, but there will also be benefits. And NYSERDA has compared the anticipated costs of the three action scenarios with the benefits and job creation opportunities for each. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the predominance of certain foundational strategies, Common to all three action scenarios, the costs and benefits are fairly similar across all three action scenarios. So different action scenarios will likely be selected on criteria other than their potential to achieve the required emission reductions or their costs and benefits. We currently spend about $150 billion per year on costs related to energy consumption. Of that $150 billion, about $50 billion goes for fuels and electricity, with almost $30 billion of that $50 billion leaving New York State, primarily for petroleum fuels purchased from outside the state. The incremental investment needed to make this necessary transition over the next 30 years is about 10% in additional system spending, or $280 to $340 billion, which is a fairly small portion over 30 years of our state's $1.7 trillion gross state product. When accounting for both the economic impacts of climate change, using DEC's social cost of carbon guidance, and a monetization of health benefits, NYSERDA estimates that investments of that relatively small proportion of our state's gross state product would yield net benefits of $90 to $120 billion between now and 2050. So benefits beyond the cost of $90 to $120 billion. This assessment of benefits does not even include job creation or additional economic development opportunities, such as that wind turbine assembly facility being constructed down the road from me. But there is a separate job study that projects that overall employment in the energy, buildings, and transportation sectors from 2019 through 2050 will increase by at least 268,000 jobs, or a 54% increase in the workforce. The job study revealed that New York State stands to see 10 jobs added in growing clean energy sectors for every job potentially displaced, such as those in the conventional heating or fuel sectors, and the wage profile shows that the largest increase will come in middle wage. The largest wage increase will come in middle wage positions. A large portion of these net benefits will be in the form of public health and would apply across all action scenarios. As we reduce combustion of fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we will be eliminating our largest source of other pollutants that cause and exacerbate a variety of cardiorespiratory illnesses, particularly among the elderly, children, folks with asthma, the urban poor, and outside workers. We also anticipate health benefits associated with efforts to encourage non-motorized transportation, particularly more walking and biking. The choice we face as New Yorkers is the same one faced by every other major economy across the world. No one economy can, by making changes, is sufficient. No one economy can have a significant impact on what happens around the world, but we all face billions of dollars of damages to property and life that will be incurred as a result of unabated climate change, or we can take the leadership role in investing billions of dollars in infrastructure to upgrade our buildings, vehicles, and electric grid, creating jobs and making our society cleaner, more efficient, and more resilient. The draft scoping plan includes strategies to reduce emissions from 6 major emission sectors: transportation, buildings, power generation, industry, agriculture and forestry, and waste. And it has recommended cross-sector policies for land use, local government clean energy, and adaptation and resilience. And of course, I can't go through all these policies in detail, but I'll mention of just a few that I think may be of interest to this group. Although achieving additional carbon, soil, and forestry sequestration to offset 15% of our emissions will be difficult, as I've mentioned, the draft plan includes numerous regulatory and investment strategies to maximize what we can achieve, including development of a statewide conservation framework, support for improved wetlands protection, which the legislature and governor have already adopted, and local and private forest and soil stewardship. Smart growth is central to strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled and their associated transportation emissions. Many of the draft scoping plan's land use strategies are focused on strengthening the role of regional and county-based land use planning to guide, inform, and incentivize smart, equitable, sustainable land use decisions at the municipal level. Other transportation strategies include encouraging a rapid transition to zero-emission vehicles and non-road equipment, and lowering the carbon content of fossil transportation fuels by promoting blending of renewable fuels and use of cleaner fuels such as green hydrogen. The draft plan includes promotion of transit-oriented development as a critical element of smart growth by making public transportation and low carbon transportation alternatives more affordable, attractive, accessible, and convenient, and planning infrastructure and development to allow more efficient and sustainable use of our landscape. To support communities in achieving smart growth development patterns, the draft plan includes direct planning assistance in the form of planning grants, technical assistance, and capacity building, and providing the tools and resources necessary for localities to make the best and most informed decisions about where to grow, how to grow, and where not to grow. Importantly, the draft plan recommends that steps be taken to ensure alignment of state funding resources from economic development to infrastructure to housing and everything in between that influences land use outcomes. The draft scoping plan includes policies to encourage use and promotion of energy efficiency and clean energy by local governments. These policies include development of tools such as a statewide communities dashboard of community greenhouse gas emissions inventories to promote local climate action planning, monitoring equity considerations, measurements of progress, and to ensure that data are consistent across county and municipal levels. Recognizing that most municipalities can benefit from additional technical support, the plan calls for expansion of existing programs such as NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities Coordinators, which you folks I suspect are glad to hear, as well as DEC's Climate Smart Community Coordinators. Policies include development of tools and resources to empower communities to participate fully in the process of planning for and enabling development of clean energy sources. In addition to the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, the draft scoping plan includes recommendations related to adaptation and resilience. The 60+ adaptation and resilience recommendations are grouped as 12 initiatives organized under these 3 broad themes. These recommendations are not binding on any agency or other entity, but we are already pursuing implementation of some of them, and I will mention just a few of the more important recommendations now. The building capacity theme comprises 4 initiatives related to statewide planning, consideration of future conditions in state decision-making, enhancement of our general understanding of climate change and of the public's adaptive capacity, and in identifying options for financing adaptation and reducing or shifting risk. Chief among the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel's adaptation recommendations within this theme are that the governor appoint a chief state resilience officer and direct that officer to develop a comprehensive state adaptation plan. New York State does not have anyone at the executive chamber level coordinating all of its adaptation and resilience activities. The panel recommended that as the #1 priority. The panel developed recommendations under 5 initiatives to help municipalities prepare for and react to increasingly severe climate hazards. These initiatives included recommendations to expand state support for regional and local planning for incorporating future conditions into local planning and regulatory decisions. Such support would include guidance and information, online decision support tools, direct technical assistance, and funding. The panel made specific recommendations to address risk due to flooding through additional floodplain assessments, right sizing of road crossing infrastructure, and strengthening the building code. And the panel made recommendations related to extreme heat and green infrastructure planning, which the governor has already taken up by directing DEC and NYSERDA to develop an extreme heat action plan. So that work has already commenced. And finally, the panel recommended action to ensure resilience of our energy system, including requirements for utilities and power generators to assess and address their system vulnerabilities to extreme weather. Although the council has released its draft scoping plan, it has more work to do. Upcoming council meetings will include additional discussion of several critical topics, including potential use or abandonment of our current gas infrastructure and financing implementation of the plan, including potential carbon pricing. These are not topics that were taken up by the advisory panel and or have been left to the council to decide on. As I begin to wrap up, let me encourage you to review the entire draft scoping plan if you are of a mind, or any of its sector-specific chapters that might relate to your interest or expertise. You can see all the information at climate.ny.gov, and input is being accepted through June 10th. You can submit written comments through an online form at climate.ny.gov or via email to scopingplan@nycerta.gov. And there are hearings scheduled. The council has extended the public comment period to June 10th and has scheduled 8 in-person hearings and 2 virtual hearings. Pre-registration for the in-person hearings, those 8 in-person hearings, is not required. Pre-registration is not required, but it is strongly encouraged, as priority in seating and speaking will be given to those who pre-register at climate.ny.gov. In-person hearings will be will be webcast in real time for viewing purposes only. You will not be allowed to make verbal comment or to submit comments via the chat or what have you during the in-person hearings. The links are for live viewing only. They are being recorded, however, and the links to the recordings are available at climate.ny.gov with the hearing schedule. Members of the public who do wish to provide oral comment must attend one of the in-person hearings or one of the 2 virtual hearings that have been scheduled. But anyone may submit written comment as I've described. It is not necessary to speak at more than one hearing, as equal weight will be given to statements made in each forum. Equal weight will also be given to written and oral comments, but those with lengthy statements who want to make oral comment at a hearing should also submit them in writing, as oral statements will be limited to 2 minutes in length. If you are planning to participate in one of the hearings that are coming up, you might want to review the recording of the hearings that have taken place to date to get a feel for how they are managed. They actually move them along pretty quickly. Individuals who pre-register to speak are assigned in the order in which the registrations are received to groups of 5 or 6. All the hearings I've seen, they've had 2 microphones, and group 1 comes up, and while they're talking, group 2 comes up and gets ready, and they move it along, the hearings along very quickly. As time allows, people who have not pre-registered to speak but then decide they do wish to speak are allowed to do so. Of the hearings I've seen, they have never run out of time. They have always finished before 7 o'clock, but it would be to your benefit if you do wish to speak to pre-register. So with that, my contact information is there. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. I'll leave that up for a moment, and then I guess we will take questions.
So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
I'll make one other comment.
Mark?
Yes.
It's Mary Underhill from Livingston County.
Hi.
I just have a question that came up this morning. I was talking to one of our power companies, and they were talking about solar development in Livingston County and how we're participating. We think that we'll have about 4,000 acres in solar by the end of next year installed. and maybe another 1,000 acres in the next 2 years. And he said, maybe you'll have them built, but he said, or maybe you anticipate that they'll be in. He said, but because of materials and lack of availability, he said everything is just stalling and it's backing up. And I guess I was curious what the discussions were about being able to meet the goals, but then having a barrier presented that makes it not feasible. I'm sure you guys have discussed it ad nauseum, but that's the reality of it. Is we're participating, but he said from our perspective, he said we're just going to stack them up. And he said, and when they come online, they come online.
Yeah, I don't think there's any choice but to do that. And frankly, I have not. And there's a big group that is putting all this on, and I have not been involved in any discussions about supply chain interruptions. But we all know that they're occurring. I mean, that's just a fact of the world economy as it stands now. But I don't see any option other than to, as you say, stack them up, get the paperwork done and the arrangements made, and they'll get built when they can get built. I don't know whether there are efforts being made in any way, what any state agency can do to streamline, getting materials and so forth to these locations. It's a question I can ask, but I don't have anything more specific to that. But I think the reality is we're probably going to be stymied more by local opposition to utility scale renewable siting than materials availability. That's my personal impression. But there are, and I don't know about Livingston, but there are some areas of the state where there is vociferous opposition to any utility scale renewables being installed. And some of that is being pushed by fossil fuel companies and other interests. Some of it perhaps is legitimate concerns about loss of farmland and forest land.
So I have another question, but I don't want to take the floor if someone else wants to. Tom, did you have a question? No. You ended that sentence with forest and ag protection. So I'm curious about the climate action plan goals that are directly in conflict with one another. So, solar and battery energy storage and movement in that direction. But at the same time, the climate action plan definitely acknowledges that the protection of agricultural land and forestry is part of our carbon sequestration. I'm like, how do you do both? How is the plan?
And the only way to do both is to achieve balance. I mean, I think that's the question, and how do we achieve that balance is, I think, one of the trickier things we are going to have to negotiate. No one likes to see prime farmland taken up. But you look at the alternatives, and and I think reality, especially maybe not so much in the western part of the state as in the southeast part of the state. A lot of farmland, if it weren't put in solar development or wind development, would be cul-de-sac. Many farmers are being faced with economic drivers where they're going to sell the land regardless of what anyone else does, and they can sell it to a developer or they can to a housing developer, and we need housing too, or they can sell it to a solar or wind developer, and that may be the choice that many of these people actually face, not keeping it in a farm.
Our population in Livingston County are very rural communities, so the chances of 5,000 acres converting into cul-de-sac not going to happen here. But I find these, some of these inherent issues within the climate action plan, and the concern is that we're going to be rubber banding all over the place. So we grab for solar and battery energy storage, and then all of a sudden we're going to be rushing towards food issues. And so, like, how do you, we've got acres and acres of land coming down for, forest and ag coming out. And then, I don't know, it's posing a real issue for our communities to participate when there's inherent barriers and conflicts within.
Understood, and
Yeah.
you know, we certainly hear that and feel it ourselves, and you can imagine internally we have that
I
between
bet.
our lands and forest folks and the people in my office. And I'm a wildlife biologist by training. Habitat protection is what I did for a number of years of my career. So I certainly feel understand that conundrum we're in. I will say that NYSERDA has or is in the process of revising the scorecard that it uses and to prioritize the investments it makes in when it purchases renewable energy credits and so forth. So it's a topic we're well aware of.
Okay.
Thanks. I was going to say one other thing that may be of interest, especially to folks in rural areas. There was a rumor started that the Climate Action Council is going to ban the sale or ban wood burning, that people in New York State would not be permitted to burn wood in their private homes. That is absolutely not true. There is no proposal in the draft scoping plan to eliminate combustion of wood. And in fact, it is for some of these, for North Country locations in particular, that might actually see -13, -15 degree temperatures, where a heat pump like I have in Albany and has done just fine doesn't work. And in those situations, we would recommend a backup, and that might be gas, renewable natural gas system, or wood, especially if someone has a local source of wood. And this idea that, in fact, we just got a letter from a town supervisor, a town that passed a resolution opposing this proposal to eliminate combustion of wood in the draft scoping plan. Well, if they had actually read the scoping plan, they would not have found anything that proposed to eliminate wood combustion. So this has been very unfortunate. It's wasted a lot of people's time, barking up the wrong tree. So I just wanted that out there, but it's particularly because I know a lot of you are in rural areas and may hear that concern.
On that one, Mark, when we had taken a look at the climate action plan, what we were concerned about was that we would, and I'm so glad you clarified that. What we understood was that we might have to do heat pumps, and then that we might end up having some homes having to do both, and that would be cost prohibitive. And so we'll have to go back and take a look at that section, because we were concerned our folks would not be able to comply because of dollars.
Right. Well, and certainly there are going to be things for which the state is going to have to provide financial support. Those programs have not been worked out yet. The state already provides incentives for heat pumps and for electric vehicles, and I don't think there's any doubt that the state will have to come up with a program that provides that kind of support. A lot of these things, I frankly, I drive an electric car. I have I've turned off the gas in my house. We don't cook or dry clothes or heat the house with anything but electricity. And my experience has been a lot of these things are cheaper in the long run. The operating costs are lower. The hurdle is actually the upfront capital investment. Right. And so that's where the state will have to continue to, I think, to provide and expand help with that upfront capital investment. The question is, where does that funding come from? Is it a cap and trade program? Is there a carbon tax? Is there a cap and invest program? And those are the issues that the council will have to wrestle with. I mean, we're already doing it with New York State's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Provides a lot of the funding that's used for those incentives. And so it drives down emissions from power plants. And has made our power plants improved efficiency, or I should say reduced emissions from our power plants by 50% over the last 12 years or so, but has also provided a large amount of funding to support a lot of these incentive and other programs.
Hey, Mark, this is Tom Harvey in Ontario County. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. couple of questions. I guess one's a statement, I guess. Really, the balancing remark kind of hits home to me, and I think it does with a lot of upstate communities. When you look at the goals and how much off-premises solar development is being forecasted to be needed, I mean, we're talking somewhere, 4 to 7 acres per megawatt. You're talking somewhere between 157 and 274,000 acres being needed to be covered by solar panels. And given the magnitude of that, where in the plan, or where do you see, my question is, how do you see this thing being adjusted or updated? Because there's got to be a balance between, the shift away from, say, natural gas or something else doesn't make sense unless that renewable energy generation capacity is there to support it.
Sure.
And how do you see that evolving over time with this plan once it's in place?
Well, and I have to be honest, I'm not an energy planner. That's not the part that I worked on. And so my understanding of that is limited at best. There is information on, the assumptions that are made in the modeling. And there has been a grid study, and you can find that at climate.ny.gov if you want to look at the details about and that apparently discusses the transmission and distribution needs as well as the generation needs. I don't know that we know exactly how it's all, there's no map that shows where every new solar panel is going to go at this point. This is a conceptual strategic plan that will get more detailed with the energy plan and then subsequent lower level planning. I would say that one of the reasons there's so much investment in offshore wind, even though that's the most expensive way at this point to generate electricity, is because it has a much smaller footprint than solar, and trying to do as much offshore wind as practical to relieve that pressure. And certainly there's a lot of interest in continuing to develop rooftop solar as well. I mean, we talk about utility scale solar, but we should be putting solar on every developed surface that we can. But this analysis so far has indicated that's limited. I think I read that only 40% of rooftops in New York City are solar accessible. So there's a limit to how much we can get from just rooftop solar.
Absolutely. And again, my numbers are what they're forecasting for the need for off-premise solar. So that's assuming everything that the model shows.
Sure.
On-premises rooftop is constructed. So it's still a daunting amount of land area, and expecting, ORES to be able to get through and approve that magnitude. I mean, that's a heavy lift.
It sure is. Yes.
And I guess the other thing that I thought, again, this is a comment, not to be, it's one of those things that local government is always cognizant of, and I think the state needs to be cognizant of it, when you're dealing with another level of government. In all the years that I've, worked on grant applications at different municipalities, in our town, the thing that astounds me is the absolute lack, especially in several of the USDA programs for infrastructure, that emphasize and reward smart growth. You talk about new utility extensions, blah, blah, blah. You score extra points. I can get money every day of the week in those projects, but to go and retrofit something, an older system so that it'll support more uses in a village or a city, can't get money for that.
Yes.
It's absolutely crazy. If you're really a believer in smart growth and you're buying into that philosophy, and it's something that, whether it's, especially for non-entitlement municipalities, that when the state gets those federal funds, trying to work with the USDA and other federal sources to try to tailor those programs so they're more smart growth friendly, because that's a really handicap. A few years ago, we were able to get funding for just a few, not even 100 homes, get an 8-inch water line up over the Bristol Hills out into the middle of nowhere. But at the same time, I couldn't get any assistance at all. One of the few grant applications I've ever written that was unsuccessful for the village of Clifton Springs. And, it's absolutely insane.
Well, we did, as I mentioned, I was on the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel with Paul Byer, who I'm sure you know is the State Director of Smart Growth. And we had discussions about that. And the state does not have, let alone the federal government, a great process for coordinating these different investments. And that was a specific recommendation that the Director of State Operations develop that kind of coordinating process. And and we've got a ton of federal money coming in over the next couple of years. And I think, honestly, a number of us are worried about how that is going to be spent, and will we make of it the opportunity it should be.
I think you're exactly right. And even if you look at the ARPA funding guidelines, if I want to extend something, hey, I can use that money for infrastructure. If I want to rebuild something, not so much.
Yeah. Yes, we hear you. And there are some, and I invite you to look at the specific recommendations and comment on how they can be enhanced or ideas for implementation.
Sure.
Anything else?
Mark, I have one. This is Mary from Livingston County. This one is big for us. I don't know how other communities feel about it, and I'm sure people are going to hit on it many times, but the unfunded mandates and also just managing grants. And I know Tom is well versed on that. He's done it for years, but we've got some smaller communities that would find managing a grant a barrier for them, especially when it comes to large sums of money, or it's a complex application process, or it requires manpower or matching dollars. All of these, like, it sounds fantastic if the grants actually are in existence, but what we found is sometimes there's the promise of dollars, and then the way to qualify becomes unyieldy, and it just cannot be done. So it may sound okay to you guys, like we're offering, and our folks are saying we don't have the capacity to.
Oh, we are well aware of that. One of my, I also oversee the Climate Smart Communities program, which includes the grants program. And we are well aware of the limitations. I mean, we see it in the applications. I mean, we are required by law that this is a competitive program, and we sometimes get applications it just hurts us to reject, but it becomes difficult to score some of those from the lower capacity communities against some of the, usually bigger or more affluent communities that have professional grant writers or professional staff that are able to put together these gleaming grant proposals. We would like to be able to provide more assistance. Unfortunately, because one of the things, some people, for instance, we just announced the Climate Smart Community Coordinators, and they're going to start work anytime now. It has been suggested that those folks could assist some of our lower capacity communities in applying for and managing grants. The problem is we can't put a state resource behind individual communities in a competitive process. So one of the things we've thought about doing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this would work and or perhaps alternatives, is funding a different set of people, I don't know what we would call them, ombudsman or something, that could in fact work with especially lower capacity communities or disadvantaged communities to enhance their competitive capacity as well as their ability to manage a grant once they got it. I think there are some states that actually do that, and we would certainly be open to that.
That's a great idea.
If we could figure out how to do it.
We use that here in Ontario. We use that model with, of course, there's a lot of small business or business assistance, relief grants, loan programs having to do with COVID relief, right? And so instead of putting our money into a program, we just hired a firm to work with small businesses because we assumed they did not have the capacity to learn or the administrative capacity to administer grants or loan programs when they got it. So we put our money into giving them that assistance, and it's been very, very successful. So I would really embrace that model.
We'll have to look at that. Anyone else?
Anybody have any other questions? If not, I want to thank Mark for his time today and joining us to help us learn more about CLCPA. We did record this, so if anybody would like a copy of it, I would be happy to send that out once we have it ready. And other than that, if you guys have any questions or comments or feedback, please let me know. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Very helpful. Thanks.